This classic Sega Ages collection, Volume 1, would feature 3 of the most iconic arcade games released by Sega during the mid-80s that would go down in history as among some of the greatest games ever made. That would be addictive, yet frustrating and challenging, but would also pave the way for a lot of other games of similar types to be brought into the mainstream from other developers and even among Sega themselves. And these versions here in this collection represent almost near-perfect arcade representations of the original games themselves, so they're definitely worth looking at, which we will do so here. Space Harrier started off life originally in the arcade and would later be ported to a multitude of different systems, even with the Sega Master System in 1986, with Space Harrier 2 being one of the earliest launch titles of the Sega Mega Drive in 1989. That will go down in history as one of the all-time classics released by Sega, that acts as a third-person rail shooter that utilises pseudo 3D graphics, as for its time it felt way ahead of anything else that was out there, because everything was moving at you in a fast-paced style of environment and everything looked totally different from other games that was out there, where literally everything will come at you and your goal is to use your weapons to shoot everything on screen in order to rack up points to increase your overall scores, where you'll have to defend against a variety of different alien hordes or ships with boss battles at the end of each level, and the game becomes equally more challenging the further into it that you get. For me personally, my first experience with this was on the Sega Master System, as I owned it back in the day growing up when I was about 11 years old, and honestly it was one of the most challenging games that I've ever played, but at the same time it was one of those games that I simply would not stop playing until I finished it, only to find out years later that there was hidden cheat systems in place. Once you lost all your lives, you could input various button combinations that would allow you to gain a few extra continues, which was much needed in order to advance, to try and get further into the game and even complete it. Because even with dedication and skill, this game will still challenge you to a point that you'll get so far and you will more than likely lose all your lives, so by having those additional continues available definitely prolong the experience, let's just put it that way. But this version is a solid look into a near perfect arcade version that you can play in your own home, and this version of the game would also see a later re-envisioning on a later edition of the Sega Ages collection, both in Japan and in Europe, but would be completely overhauled using 3D graphics back in the mid 2000s. So if you're a fan of these classic rail shooters, you have to give this one a try.
Get ready. You're doing great. Get ready.
Afterburner 2 would be an updated re-release of the iconic Afterburner game that originally saw life in the arcade in 1987 and being ported to a multitude of different systems, from older generations even up to more modern systems within the last couple of years. They would add in extra levels, more enemies, more alternative soundtrack elements, with some additional tweaks just to improve the overall gameplay, which virtually remains unchanged from the original. So fans of the first game will be right at home here. That sees you piloting a fighter jet with the goal to reach at the end of each stage, defeating various enemies and even bosses. The game also plays very similar to another of Sega's early shooter games, with Space Harrier, which is also on this list, where you move around the screen shooting everything that moves while dodging as many obstacles and projectiles as possible in order to achieve victory. A very tough but challenging game, but yet addictive all at the same time. And this version in this collection here represents one of the true to form arcade conversions that you can find anywhere, and it does a really good job to represent all of those additional elements to make for a very worthwhile yet challenging experience. It is definitely worth a try. It would be very difficult to have any sort of Sega Classics collection on display without this iconic game, which is Outrun, which would release originally in the arcade in 1986, that would go down in history as being one of the most important and greatest driving or racing games ever made. That would see ports to a multitude of different systems, even from later with the Sega Master System, the ZX Spectrum, even home PCs or computers of the time with the Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64. There's a long list here of consoles in which this game got ports to, even with future sequels that you would see even on modern systems. And this version here would represent a very close to near perfect arcade conversion from that of the arcade original that you can play on the Sega Saturn, with all of the details, graphics, sound effects, all in its own glory. The visuals on display are nothing short of stunning, with a great level of detail, great frame rates, very little slowdown, and just generally fun and engaging and challenging gameplay. With that being said, this game also got a sole release under the Sega Ages collection in Japan, with some subtle differences that didn't make its way into this release, and mainly with the alternative soundtracks, as there was some additional changes or even additions to alternative versions of the music, which isn't in this version at all, but it is in the Japanese version. And a lot of these elements I have covered in a previous documentary video that looks at the history of Outrun, which I covered way back in the early days of the channel. I'll leave a link here on screen and below in the description that might be worth checking out also. But there's nothing that I can't say about Outrun that people probably don't already know and love about it, because it is just a phenomenal game. Me personally, it's one of the racing games that I still find myself often going back to, because regardless of which port that you play, it is an interesting experience. Even on the 8-bit versions, the 16-bit Mega Drive version was also a very good edition, but I found that the Saturn edition, even with the Japanese port, is definitely one of the closest that I've ever played to the original arcade experience. It's a very good, solid and worthwhile game that everybody I think should try. If you haven't played it already, you definitely need to give this one a go.
Checkpoint.
This iconic list of games represents some of the most near-perfect arcade conversions that were ever seen being ported to systems of the time, and the Sega Saturn proved to be the definitive console, even to the current day, for the place to play the majority of these epic classics, as the Saturn has so much capabilities with regards to 2D visuals and arcade representations. It's no surprise that it is the go-to platform to play a lot of these older games, as the level of detail on display is stunning, even with the sound effects, the graphics. It has it all in abundance to literally feel like you're playing an arcade game in your very own living room. Plus, it's a great way to revisit all of these classic games that we grew up with to bring back that nostalgia. And this is just but one of many classic collections that would make their way to future consoles being published and developed by Sega. It will provide more ways to play the many classic hits that we've come to know and love over the years, which we need to look more into, and this next video will provide that outlay, so it might be worth checking out.